Whether you were blessed enough to witness this performance, this matchup of Titans and Autzen Stadium, or you were streaming this game on your TV or maybe a TV at the bar on NBC, we all watched an all-time classic performance and a battle between two Titans last night as third-ranked Oregon knocked off second-ranked Ohio State 32-31. And I have a lot of thoughts on this matchup, but I think what I want to dive into first is an analogy, or a series of analogies, that both teams will understand. This game reminded me a lot of the Washington-Oregon games from 2023, and of the Michigan-Ohio State games of the previous two seasons, where both teams came in, I think, with brilliantly scripted drives. And both teams on a talent basis, on a developmental basis, on an NFL talent execution basis, on the basis of being national championship contenders, were relatively even. But after the scripted drives were over, and when it came time to be tough, when it came time to be gutsy, when it came time to be aggressive, to take risks, ultimately, well, one team won. And one team, in some of those games, in some of the Michigan-Ohio State games and Oregon-Washington games the previous two seasons, in some cases dominated. Oregon in this matchup played the role of Washington from the prior two seasons when they beat and coached circles around Oregon. And they also played the role of Michigan when they beat and coached circles around Ohio State. That's what this game reminded me of in a nutshell. And ultimately, both teams' seasons are far from over. With the 12-team college football playoff, both of these teams, as long as they don't win 2 games in the remainder of their schedule, which is extremely unlikely for Oregon and very unlikely for Ohio State, they're playoff locks. And even in the 4-team college football playoff, especially if the Pac-12 still existed in its full form, rest in peace to the old Pac-12, I don't think these teams, really Ohio State since they were the team that lost, that their college football playoff desires and goals would be all that much impacted here. But here we are, 2024 is 2024, and I have a lot to unpack here. But Oregon was the better coached team. Oregon was the team who, all in all, was more confident in their identity. You could feel that Autzen Stadium is a special environment that deserves its own place. I'm not saying it's the best environment in college football, but in the same way that Beaver Stadium or Death Valley or Bryant-Denny Stadium or the Shoe or the Big House, in the same way that these environments have their own special feeling, Autzen is up there. It was loud, and you could tell that Ohio State's offensive line, and I think that Will Howard as well, were rattled a little bit by the noise that Oregon fans and Autzen Stadium presented. And ultimately, there is just a lot to unpack here, but so many things went Oregon's way. Whether that was their coaching, whether that was their execution, their mental and physical toughness, the fact that they had the additional locked-in benefit of playing at home, and they won the game 32-31. And both teams, I think, are elite teams relative to the 2024 season, and both teams can win it all. But I want to unpack this game in detail and get to a few talking points about each team. But before I can do that, I ask you to please subscribe to the channel, like the video, hit the notification bell, comment your thoughts, your reaction to this game down below. Share this video around to other college football fans, fanatics who watch this game in its entirety. I'm not going to lie. I was nervous. I was sweating. My heart was pounding watching this game. And I'm not a fan of Ohio State or Oregon. I'm not. And the team that I am a fan of, Michigan, if you didn't already know that, is going to get destroyed by both Oregon and Ohio State. I would not be surprised if the combined score between Oregon and Michigan and Ohio State and Michigan was something like 84-20 or something like that. That wouldn't shock me at all. It probably won't be that extreme due to the new clock rules and the fact that those three teams love to chew clock collectively, but it will feel like that. I have no doubts about that. And also, if you want to support the channel monetarily, check out the Patreon page and the merchandise store via the link in the description or down below in the pinned comment. And this is something I beg you to do. Please join the Discord server via the link in the description or down below in the pinned comment. We need more Big Ten, more college football fans, specifically Oregon fans. There were no Oregon fans celebrating the awesome win that you guys achieved. The first top 5 win of Dan Lanning's really short career at Oregon. And there are bigger and brighter things ahead for Dan Lanning and for Oregon. I thought entering this season that he would be at Oregon for quite some time and win a national championship, maybe a few national championships, and I'm more confident in that belief that I had entering the 2024 preseason than I was before this win. A little bit of an awkward way to phrase it, but please join the Discord server, and that's free. And liking the video, subbing, commenting, sharing, all of those things, hitting the notification bell, those are the things that help out you and the channel the most, so please do them. But I want to get into this game and really dive deep and provide some talking points here. Let's get through the statistics quickly, because we spend a lot of time typically on these, but I have talking points to get to, so we're going to go through these a little bit faster. Ohio State averaged fewer yards per play and also fewer points per play than Oregon did. Ohio State actually, they ran more plays than the Ducks did, and the Ducks left more points off the board. When you watch this game in full, as I did, you realize that Oregon could have won this game by double digits. You had at the really beginning of the game a pass to Will Kazmarek that should have been an interception. It should have been. We talk about, as Ohio State and Michigan fans, the Roman Wilson Denzel Burke controversy, where people said that was an interception entering the end zone, not a touchdown. It was ended up as a touchdown because that was the ruling on the field and there wasn't enough evidence to overturn it. That interception by, I believe, Jeffrey Bassa, or what ended up being a catch, but what I thought was an interception, that was more clear as an interception than the Denzel Burke over Roman Wilson was. Wasn't reviewed. Ohio State did what they should have done. Very good coaching move. They went quickly to the line and snapped the football before it could be reviewed. But that could have been an Oregon takeaway. And then when you look at the missed field goal, which Atticus Sappington's very accurate, typically doesn't miss those, the botched extra point, the bad 2-point conversion call that was only called because of the bad extra point, you realize that Oregon could have won this game by double digits. They didn't. It's a credit to Ohio State, their defense, their offense. It's also something concerning for Oregon because they shot themselves in the foot, I'd say, more than Ohio State did, but they made up for it by being more aggressive. I'm going to assume that onside kick was intentional. I'm assuming that just based off of the formation, the way that Oregon set up their kickoff formation and how their kickoff specialist executed that kick, that was intentional. I don't know if hitting the player that he hit was intentional, but I think that was going to be at minimum a squib kick. And the fact that hit Ohio State's player, Oregon stole away a drive, that's aggression. That was a calculated decision. And it also wouldn't shock me if that 12 men on the field penalty was also a calculated decision. But I think that's a little bit more of a gray area than that onside kick. Oregon was more aggressive. They were willing to take more deep shots through the air. It felt like they trusted their quarterback more, and they put him in better positions and the offense in better positions to score and to confuse Ohio State's defense than Ohio State's defense tried to confuse Oregon's defense. That's why you get Ohio State averaging a amazing 6.9 yards per play. If you told me that entering the game, that Ohio State would average 6.9 yards per play and 0.456 points per play, I would have said, yeah, my 31-20 prediction that Ohio State would win by double digits would go through. But Oregon averaged 7.6 yards per play and 0.492 points per play. I was wrong. guys. I was honestly wrong. And the biggest area where I was wrong was the fact that Ohio State's rushing offense would take over. A little bit of a chuckle there. That didn't happen at all. And also that Ohio State's number one defense does not look like the best defense in the country. It does not. Maybe they are, and maybe Oregon's offense is just that good at their ceiling, and I'm inclined to believe that. But the repetitiveness of Ohio State's defensive play calling and some of the mistakes that their defenders made is a bit concerning. And you see that reflected in that this was a shootout, true and true. 63 combined points, and both offenses averaged over 0.4 points per play and around 7 yards per play, which is pretty good numbers. And ultimately, you see that with the onside kick recovery, which is basically a turnover, the fumble by Quinshon Judkins in Ohio State territory, that's 2 turnovers right there, the 8 penalties for 70 yards, the offensive pass interference, the multiple false starts where even when Josh Simmons was healthy, and please be praying for him. I hope that he gets healthy and can somehow come back this year, but they said in the press conference that that may be unlikely. You hate to see players get hurt, and I really hope and pray that he's healthy. But even with him in, that O-line looked rattled, and Oregon really only having that one turnover in that 4th and goal from the 2, where Tez Johnson, by the way, was wide open. Gabriel reads that play properly. That's a touchdown. And the 3 penalties for 25 yards. Oregon played. It's weird to say this with some of the mistakes they made, but they played a fairly clean game because Ohio State did force Oregon into some tough spots. Like, Oregon didn't just make some of those stupid decisions. Ohio State assisted them in making those stupid decisions by playing good football at times. You look at this game and it was so good that it feels wrong to say that one team played cleaner than the other because there's multiple different angles you can take. And this is where I really want to get into these talking points here, because you can't overreact. You shouldn't. You should not overreact to this game. People are saying, well, should Ohio State fire Ryan Day? You're an idiot if you think that, at least right now. Or maybe you're a visionary. Maybe Ohio State loses to Penn State and Indiana, and if they go 9-3, I will admit that I was wrong in defending Ryan Day, because 9-3 at Ohio State is just blatantly unacceptable. If they somehow lose to this Michigan team, I will retract my support for Ryan Day. However, this is a road matchup, multiple time zones away. Oregon clearly saved a crap ton for this game. A lot. I mean, Evan Stewart was a non-factor for Oregon in their first 5 games. And he comes alive and he is abusing what we all thought was Ohio State's best corner in Denzel Burke. Like taking candy away from a baby. Like ripping the ball from what should have been a pick by Denzel Burke in the end zone, or beating him straight up. And talk about physicality. Derek Harmon just ripping the ball away from Quinshon Judkins, just ripping it, strength on strength there, and Oregon won that battle. But I think more importantly for Ohio State, we'll get to the physicality and the questions about that later, but they had it in the bag. You run the football from the 28, probably pick up 2 or 3 yards, you center the field goal, and Jaden Fielding makes it. And we're talking about 34-32, and the narratives are completely flipped. Like, I would still have some concerns about Ohio State if Ohio State won 34-32. I'd still be telling you there are some issues with physicality. The O-line is not that deep. Going forward without Josh Simmons is going to be painful if you want to win it all. If it's a natty or bust season, that will be hard. But they didn't win. Inside of the 28, why are you passing? Why don't you run with Will Howard or run with Travion Henderson? Why? I'm sitting there thinking to myself, the game is won. Just run the football. Center the kick. You have 1 timeout. Oregon has 3, and they will probably use them to preserve a few seconds if they feel like you are just going to run the ball to center the kick. Probably. Like you have a few more plays to get a few more yards on the ground where there is not a risk, the same risk at least, of turning the football over, of not getting a holding call, etc. But no. Instead, Ohio State and their staff decides that they are going to put the game in the hands of a true freshman who earlier in the game made some mistakes. Against Iowa had a mistake. And Jeremiah Smith is awesome, but two hands, pushing the DB away, shoving him away like it's a wrestling match and not a football game. What are you doing? What are you doing? I don't understand it at all. You run the football there every single time. And I understand that against Georgia in 2022, that didn't work. I understand that. And maybe that wouldn't have been the correct call. And I'm playing hypothetical here. I'm admitting that. But I felt like run the football there. Run it. Because if it fails, you have the timeout. Or Oregon has the timeout. If you run the football there and you lose a yard or maybe two, it's better than the 15-yard offensive pass interference call. It's way, way better than that. Way better. The staff choked this game away. Jim Knowles is calling the same thing over and over and over again. We're going to only rush 4, and we're going to sit and wait for you to make a mistake. One problem: Oregon made no mistakes in the passing attack outside of that 4th and goal. They didn't make any. They kept getting behind the defense over and over and over again. And only rushing 4 and not stacking the box when Jordan James is behind a healthy, talented Oregon offensive line is not winning football. It's not. As I said earlier in this video, this looked like Washington versus Oregon in 2022 and the 2 times in 2023. It looked like Michigan versus Ohio State in 2022 and 2023. Really, it looked like Oregon versus Ohio State, Ohio State versus Michigan in 2022, where Oregon's rushing offense is being held at an honest arm's length, and they can't do all that much early, but big passing plays are tearing this Ohio State defense up. It looked, minus the long rushing touchdowns by Donovan Edwards, Oregon's offense looked exactly like Michigan's in 2022. We are going to fling the ball deep. We're going to take deep shots. We're going to occasionally use our tight ends and wide receivers in short distance, and we're going to play good protection. And we're going to run the football to keep you honest. And at the end of the game, Jordan James and Dylan Gabriel had shown that their rushing attack was wearing down Ohio State's rushing defense. That Ohio State defensive line didn't get a single sack. They only had 2 TFLs. And Jordan James was plowing through for additional yards. And Oregon was doing what I thought Iowa was going to do. They were blocking up that defensive line very well. And if not for Tyleik Williams and a few good plays, occasionally here and there by individual defensive linemen, not as a collective, Oregon could have ran for a whole lot more. They could have. The staff choked this game away. They had it in the bag. You run it 9 times out of 10 with whether it's Will Howard, Quinton Judkins, who didn't have a good game, or Henderson, who was the only reason why Ohio State had a rushing attack in this game. You run that inside the 30. Fielding was accurate with that first field goal attempt from 40 yards. You run it, get it close to 40 yards, center it, and you kick it. And you probably win because Jaden Fielding is an accurate field goal kicker. It felt like watching this game, honestly, that Ohio State returned 15 starters to simply regress on defense and struggle to run the football. Is that what happened here? Is that what happened here? And I'm going to get to some positives about Ohio State before we move on to Oregon. But is that what happened here? The Buckeyes returned 15 starters. They brought in Quinton Judkins with a massive NIL deal. And Will Howard played great. There's no reason to say that Will Howard lost the game. That's ridiculous. That is a casual take. Everything except Will Howard contributed to this loss. Everything except QB, and wide receiver. The 2022 redo, where quarterback and wide receiver kept Ohio State in the game and helped them nearly dominate against Georgia, along with part of the offensive line, and they helped them beat Penn State that year when Penn State outran them and did better stopping the run and running the football. That's kind of what it felt like to me in this game, is what we've seen from Ohio State these past few years, and really all this year except for the Iowa game, where it felt like Ohio State was winning games because they could simply out-athlete everyone. And the minute they can't out-athlete anyone, the confidence falls apart, the lines of scrimmage eventually get worn down, and they lose in a close game, and they still look like a really good team, but they don't pull away and win. They don't wear down their opponents, and returning 15 starters and losing this game in the fashion that they did, especially with all they brought back on defense, the talent they have on defense, and with the talent they have in the running back room and all they brought back on the offensive line, it's honestly just disappointing. The game management at the end, the I'm tumbling over my words here, but the distancing yourself from running the football finally got to that. And the run defense getting worn down and the pass defense just getting abused. It's nonsense. It honestly is nonsense. You cannot solely rely on athletes to win. You can't do it. Just can't do it. Can't happen. It's not going to happen. It's not going to work in the Big Ten. It's not. This is something that, by the way, for all the talk I give about how I think Ryan Day's a better head coach than Urban Meyer, and I still think so, this is something that Urban Meyer understood. You cannot simply out-athlete your opponents. You just can't do it. You have to come up big and be physical to win in the Big Ten. Now, granted, Urban Meyer played in a weak sauce Big Ten. He did. There was no 2021 through 2023 Michigan. There was no Dan Lanning Oregon. There wasn't. There was no Kalen DeBoer Washington. The Penn State teams of this year and last year were better than the average Penn State team that Urban Meyer played. Just being real right there. And when there was a team that was on Ohio State's level, really Michigan State under Mark D'Antonio, well, Urban Meyer got out-coached and very often out-physicaled as well. But still, he understood that. It's why he won the Big Ten. It's why he won a national championship. It's why he beat Michigan in 2016. You cannot solely rely on receivers, quarterbacks, and skill position players to win football games. And it felt like in this game that Ohio State had an easier time scoring than Oregon because their receivers were that good and because Will Howard was throwing some ridiculously impressive NFL-type throws. It felt like quarterback and wide receiver were carrying a team that was being beat on the lines of scrimmage and that was being out-coached in the booth and on the field because you have Jeremiah Smith. You have Emeka Egbuka, who have ridiculous athleticism. They have good speed. They have good hands. They have impressive vertical jumps. And they have impressive balance. They can do it all. And they compensated for some really interesting and not in a good way coaching decisions and occasionally some overthrows by Will Howard. So that's a takeaway for me with Ohio State. You look at Jeremiah Smith here, 9 receptions, 100 yards and a touchdown, and then for Quinton Judkins, 11 carries, 23 yards and a touchdown. And Smith was close to a non-factor in the first half, and he was really only a massive factor in a positive way in 2 drives, and the final drive where he had that big catch, but then also the OPI sort of cancels out. This is what happens when you solely rely on athletes. Even though they are elite players, Quinton Judkins, who's a top 10 running back, finishes averaging 2.2 yards per carry and not being a factor at all. Seriously. TreVeyon Henderson's the best running back, and if you take out his 53-yard carry, Ohio State only ran for 2.7 yards per carry. It's not good enough. You go back to all Ohio State games against top 5 opponents since 2020. Ohio State, on an average basis, has been outrushed by 20 yards in all of those games. Oregon this year, Michigan and Penn State last season, and we're talking about power ratings, not just, well, you finished rated in the AP poll or coaches poll, because we all know those polls are not as accurate as FPI or S&P Plus. 22 versus Georgia and Michigan, 21 versus Michigan, and 20 versus Alabama and Clemson. In those games, Ohio State, on average, has had a negative 0.81 yards per carry differential, a negative 20.6 straight-up rushing yards differential. You look at, well, every Ohio State top 5 matchup in power rating since 2020, because COVID was COVID. Ohio State on an average basis has been outrushed by 61 yards per game in those top 5 games. They have had a negative 1.58 yards per carry differential. You look at Ohio State games against top 5 power rated opponents since 2022 when Jim Knowles got here. It's improved, but still Ohio State has allowed opponents to outgain them by about 32, 33 yards on the ground in those top 5 games, and they've had a negative 1.14 yards per carry differential. And I factored out sacks, so Kyle McCord is taken out of the picture because he was about as mobile as a statue, and CJ Stroud outside of that Georgia game was factored out because he wasn't a factor in the rushing offense. So you factor out sacks, you factor out anything to do with the pass, and you solely look at the run. Ohio State on an average basis has been out-physicaled on the ground in nearly every game of critical importance since the 2020 splattering in the national championship game. You just cannot rely on skill position players to win. It's not a smart strategy if you want to win a national championship and if you want to win in the Big Ten. It may actually work in the SEC because the SEC this year outside of Texas looks like dog water. It honestly does. But even then, you match up with Texas right now. Texas, even with a far inferior running back room, I'd be tempted to say they may outrush Ohio State with that much less talent at running back because they're that much better on the offensive line. They're that much deeper. And their defense right now is top 5 in efficiency. I know they haven't played really any offenses of note, but I'm a believer in Texas's defense. They look better objectively even when you factor in their opponent and competition than they did last year where their secondary was bad. And last but not least, I want to say Ohio State's season is far from over. They can easily win out and make it to Indy because they are a top 5 team, objectively. I came away from that game thinking that Ohio State is a top 2 team in the Big Ten. I came away thinking that. I came away more impressed with Ohio State's performance than I was with Penn State's performance. Just straight up telling you facts. And maybe that's because I overestimated Penn State. I thought they were going to blow out USC. But Ohio State's offense is wicked through the air. Will Howard is now top 10 in QBR and a qualifier to win the national championship outside of 2015 Alabama. You look all the way back to before 2010. Winners of the national championship game outside of Greg McElroy and Jake Coker, both under Nick Saban with awesome defenses, teams that won it all had a quarterback in the top 10 of QBR, and Will Howard is now right there. This season is far from over, and the calls to fire Ryan Day are idiocy. If anyone is going to be fired by Ohio State at the end of the year, seeing how this team is, it should be Justin Fry and Larry Johnson. Those are the names who should objectively be put on the chopping block. I don't know if that will ever happen with Larry Johnson, but honestly, after this game, the defensive line was more disappointing relative to the talent that they have compared to the offensive line. And that's a pretty damning statement because the offensive line in run blocking this year kind of looked like the run blocking we saw last year, where Henderson compensated for some of the ineptitude on that line of scrimmage. But they can make it to Indy. They can win the Big Ten. They can win out. Right now, I'd say I would heavily favor them to beat everyone remaining on their schedule outside of Penn State. And Ryan Day's undefeated versus James Franklin. History says that Ohio State will win that game. For me, the eye test says it's going to be basically a coin flip. So we'll have to see how that game goes, but they get a bye. Hopefully they'll sort things out. I still believe in the staff as an aggregate. Some of the coaches I would question, but on an individual level, collectively, this coaching staff is still very good. In this game, they had 326 passing yards, 141 rushing yards, 4 total touchdowns, and they held Oregon to 155 rushing yards. I mean, this performance, while not what I thought was going to happen, although Ohio State did score exactly 31 points, but Oregon scored 12 more points than I expected. Hence, Ohio State lost. It was not something that you wanted to see, but Oregon is an elite team relative to 2024. They are. If you want to be really down on Ohio State, the only thing I'll give you is that I think 2023 Oregon was clearly better than this Oregon team. And I think last year's Oregon team probably beats this Ohio State team by double digits. But that's not objective. That's subjective, because different years, a little bit of different staffs, different rosters, totally different rosters in the case of Oregon, who really used the portal to boost their returning production, and different game plans. And honestly, there's just so many different factors that's just a subjective opinion of mine. You don't have to agree with me on that. And I'm not going to say that that's a fact. It's what I think. I think this is a very down year in college football. I don't think that this Ohio State team right now would beat any of the national champions in the 4-team college football playoff era. I don't. They wouldn't beat any of the national champions from their own 2014 Buckeyes all the way up to the 2023 Michigan team. But they'll never face any of those teams. And everyone this year outside of Texas looks like they have their own major issues, and even Texas has some questions. So take from that what you will. No one will care if Ohio State wins out, if they go 15-1 and win it all, even if they're power rated theoretically at a lower level than the other national champions that preceded them. No one will care, and I won't. I certainly won't care. 15-1 is something that any college football fan would kill to have, and Ohio State is very much in play to earn that. You look at Oregon here. Let's talk about Oregon. We saved the best for last year. They are Big Ten ready. I said in the preseason that even though I picked Oregon to go 10-2, and it is likely now that they go 12-0, they're not losing to Michigan. They're not losing to Illinois. They're not losing to Washington or Wisconsin. Those are the toughest games remaining on their schedule. They could slip up and lose one of those games, but I doubt it. 12-0 is very realistic. It's what I'm going to be predicting Oregon to go for the rest of the year, unless I feel like there's a trap game or they just look really lethargic after this win. Because there's also the chance that what Oregon did against Ohio State in this game is what Oklahoma did to Texas last year. And Ohio State's the better team, but they were just out-coached to death in this matchup. But who knows? I certainly felt like Oregon did a better job of hiding who they are and what they wanted to do through their first 5 games of the season than Ohio State did. I certainly felt like that. And Ohio State was not as creative as Oregon. They were not as aggressive or gutsy as Oregon. When Oregon missed the extra point, I felt as if 2 things were about to happen. Either it was going to be like the 2019 Michigan game against Ohio State, where Michigan misses that extra point, and eventually you figure it's due to nerves, and this Michigan team knows they're not going to win. Or it's because Oregon is very excited, they feel like they're going to win, and this is going to be a battle. Potentially Oregon ends up taking control of this game. And it was the latter. Oregon didn't dominate, they didn't take control, but they were not nervous in the sense of they didn't believe in themselves. They were excited. They were pumped. They knew that they could win. And perhaps they knew they could win convincingly. They didn't win convincingly, like by double digits. And they could have. But they won by a point. And that's good enough because Ohio State was favored. And in a game like this, just win. Just win. It's like Michigan last year against Ohio State. And they won by 6. But that was honestly, because both of those teams were better than Georgia last year, that was the 1v2 matchup. Just win. Even if you don't dominate, it's okay. Just win. It'd be the same thing for Ohio State if they won 34-32. Just win. Yes, there are some concerns, but you're undefeated and you're leading the Big Ten right now. And that's the story for Oregon. They showed that they're physical. They are tough mentally, physically. They don't shy away from their identity. They right now are the team that is best built to win the Big Ten right now. with the way they ran the football, with how their defensive line played down their best defensive end, with how their offensive line played after the struggles early this season. This is the team that is best built to win the Big Ten. This is the team that most closely resembles, outside of maybe Penn State, who I think trails behind them in this category, in resembling Michigan of the previous 3 years. Right now, of teams that resemble the previous 3 Michigan teams who won the Big Ten and convincingly controlled that conference, it's Oregon. Oregon's the closest to those type of teams. And then Penn State follows behind them. And then Ohio State, I would honestly, after another disappointing performance in the trenches, I'd slide them at third. Ohio State does not look like a 2022 Georgia or a 2022 or 2023 Michigan, or certainly not a 2021 Georgia. They don't look like that. Maybe they'll be that way at the end of the year, but they have things to fix. As for Oregon right now, they showed that they're Big Ten ready. They had 155 rushing yards. They averaged 5 yards per carry. Jordan James was trucking at times through tackles to pick up the extra 1-2 yards because college football is a battle of inches, and Oregon won the battle of inches. The trenches opened up lanes for Jordan James to run through, and they held Ohio State to 141 rushing yards and 4.3 yards per carry. They're Big Ten ready. There's absolutely no doubt about that. And I think Dan Lanning's a top 10 head coach. He and his staff worked Ohio State staff all game long, whether it was the onside kick, whether it was taking deep shots against a secondary that I still thought was the best secondary entering this game. That's not the case anymore. I know that Oregon's receivers are good. Oregon, I think, may actually have more speed at receiver than Ohio State does, which is a high compliment. But you got cooked. The Silver Bullets got cooked. They got put in a pressure cooker and exploded in the pressure cooker. Dylan Gabriel does not have a Bo Nix caliber arm. He does not even have a J.J. McCarthy caliber arm. But what he does have is accuracy, and he knows when he has a mismatch. And Oregon had several mismatches that went their way in this game. And that's a credit not just to Gabriel, who's clearly a good field general. Same thing with Will Howard, by the way. Will Howard and Gabriel both had over 90 quarterback efficiency ratings in those games. Really near elite to elite QBs, Will Howard and Dylan Gabriel are. And kudos to them. They should not feel one bit of doubt about their performances. Not one bit. And you look at Oregon and how Will Stein was able to identify those matchups, how Tosh Lupoy, who I said publicly that I didn't have faith in him as a defensive coordinator, he was able to just get enough pressure and do enough things at the point of attack when Ohio State ran the football to make them drift away from running. Ohio State only ran the ball 7 times in the second half. Only ran it 7 times. They completely abandoned the run. And part of me thinks that may have been good calculus because Oregon was doing a very good job of stopping Ohio State from running the ball. Again, you factor out that 53-yard run from Henderson, Ohio State averaged less than 3 yards per carry. I mean, it really felt like Ohio State's rushing attack, to make another analogy, was like Michigan's in 2022 against TCU. They had one long run, and outside of that, they didn't do all that much. So they had to pivot to the passing offense. Unlike J.J. McCarthy versus TCU, Ohio State pivoting to the passing offense worked. But you still wish that wasn't the case because trench play wins championships. It does. You know the phrase defense wins championships as applied to the national championship level, to the national championship trophy, the spot of being the best team in the country? Well, focus that in on trench play, the D-line and the O-line. And then when you look at the Big Ten specifically, interior trench play wins Big Ten championships. Derek Harmon was the best defensive tackle on the field, and Oregon's guards did more to open up the ground game than Ohio State's did. Oregon's interior offensive line and defensive line looked better than Ohio State's interior did. And to circle back to really what I was saying about Tosh Lupoy, remember, he blitzed. He adapted. He sent pressure. He said, Something has to change because they are eating my secondary alive, despite the fact that we know they're going to pass. They're eating our secondary regardless. Something has to change. He tried to make changes, and oftentimes it wasn't enough to stop Ohio State, but he tried to be adaptive, and Oregon does not have the same talent on defense that Ohio State does. He called a better game than Jim Knowles did. And I don't know if you take that away for more of a positive for Oregon or a negative for Ohio State. I'd say the truth is somewhere in the middle. Jim Knowles got a little exposed, but I still think he is one of the better DCs in the country. Tosh Lupoy put his name in that category of potentially being one of the better DCs in the country. This is a more physical defense than what Oregon had last year. I know that for sure. Lanning earned his first top 3 win. I already mentioned that, but it has to be mentioned again because this Ohio State team I thought was the best team in the country entering this game. So I picked them to win 31-20. They didn't. Ultimately, they lost. It is what it is. But man, Lanning did such a good job in this game, being gutsy when he had to. I mean, the reason they went for it on 4th and goal, hindsight's 2020. They probably should have kicked the field goal on that 4th and goal. He went for it there because Ohio State was scoring touchdowns on the majority of their drives. I was surprised at the fact that Oregon forced Ohio State to settle for a field goal on their final score because Ohio State is ridiculously efficient in the red zone. That's something they're clearly better at than they have been in the previous, I'd even say 2 years. Their red zone efficiency is even better than the 2022 team's red zone efficiency. It's crazy. Chip Kelly has done a good job. Ryan Day, Chip Kelly, Brian Hartline, Carlos Loughlin, Justin Fry, Keenan Bailey. Those offensive coaches have done a very good job of preparing Ohio State to execute well in the red zone. So that was the right call at the time to go for it on 4th and goal. It was. That was the right call. The onside kick was the right call. They don't make that play, Ohio State wins. It's just being real there. It was really a really impressive performance by Dan Lanning and his staff. And last but certainly not least, this Oregon offense is elite, and they are going to score on any defense they face. They would score on Iowa's. They would score on Penn State's. They would score on, obviously, Michigan's. They'd score on Ohio State again. They would score on Georgia. I think Oregon right now is better than Georgia. It's funny because Dan Lanning lost to Kirby Smart 49-3 in his first game at Oregon, and yet I feel like this season and also last season, Oregon had the better team than Georgia. What Dan Lanning is doing is very, very impressive. And I made the wrong call in this game and the wrong call on Oregon for their season as a whole, picking them to go 10-2. But I told you in the preseason, this is a physical team. And those who said that they were going to go 8-4 or 9-3, and there were those people, or who thought that they would get blown out by Ohio State and Michigan because their physicality was just a mirage, that was a lie. That was a lie. I thought that Michigan being at home and with what they returned on defense would be enough to beat Oregon, and that Ohio State's athletic advantage and equalized physicality, or so I thought, would be good enough to win. But those were legitimate points. I never thought for a minute that Oregon was just this team that was not going to be ready for Big Ten play. It was clear in the preseason and from last season that they were ready to compete in the Big Ten. The question was just if they were going to compete for the Big Ten championship, or rather, were they going to win those 2 games? Michigan looks very winnable, and they've beaten Ohio State. And this offense is a big part of the reason why. It is the reason why they beat Ohio State. This game, they averaged 7.6 yards per play. And in the points per play category, they forced 0.492 points per play. They had 32 total points and 496 total yards. That is a very impressive showing, in my opinion, by the Oregon Ducks. Good game by Oregon. And as for Ohio State, again, they have nothing to hang their heads about. I think on just a level of they're still a playoff team. This is a road game. They have things to fix, but to hang their head and say the season's over, They can't do that. They have to process this quickly, hopefully by the end of today, if not earlier, and they got to move on and fix some things in the bye week so that they can come out and beat Penn State, because Penn State's no pushover. This Penn State team, especially with how Ohio State looked yesterday, they have the players to match Ohio State pound for pound athletically, and they have the players to outmatch them in the trenches. So they got to get things together, and I think to a certain degree they will. As for Oregon, I think they're going to coast to Indy and, well, just make it to Indy and see who matches up with you there, and if you lose or win, you made it to Indy, and you're going to go to the college football playoff. And my MVP for this game is Dylan Gabriel, 23 of 34, 341 passing yards, 4 attempts for 32 rushing yards, and 3 total touchdowns. He had a Heisman-caliber performance in this game, and I don't think he'll win the award, but this was easily his best game of his career, and you see his high football IQ, his decision-making, and the fact that he does have talent. He's not a generationally gifted player athletically, but he has talent. He has great ball placement. You can tell that he trains and works hard, and he has underrated speed as a runner. Thank you all so much for watching this video. Remember to like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and comment your thoughts down below. Thanks to Crash2488 and Braska Rascal and Connor Little OH for sponsoring this video as Heisman members. Thanks to Chris Lane, Ismar, Tyler 9, Chilton Kush for being All-American members. And thanks to John Lynn, Roaming Gnome, Matthew Sale, Austin Christmas, Joshua Jorgensen, and Will Loftus for being all conference members. Please check out my Patreon page, merchandise store, and Discord server via the link in the description or down below in the pinned comment. Have a fantastic day, guys. Go Ducks and go Buckeyes. See you soon.